Hey guys, it's Sasha. Yesterday, Janet Yellen wrote a letter to the US Congress in which she said that the US government will be bankrupt in 2 weeks if the debt limit is not increased. The US Treasury will be unable to satisfy the government's obligations and pay the bills potentially as soon as June 1st. Technically, the US government would already have been bankrupt back in January, but on January 17th, the US Treasury enacted something called extraordinary measures so that they could continue paying their bills even though they didn't actually have the money to do it. The way the US government normally pays their bills without having any money is by printing more money, by dishing out new bonds. People go and buy the bonds, they have money to spend on other things. It's a strategy that has been so successful that the US now owes $31.4 trillion worth in debt. In fiscal year 2022, the US federal government spent $6.2 trillion while only collecting $4.9 trillion in revenue, basically tax. The difference, aka the deficit, was $1.3 trillion. So for every dollar collected in taxes, the US government borrowed an extra 28 cents on top. And the total debt pile of the United States is now the equivalent of 6.4 years worth of revenue. So if the United States earned a salary of $100,000, they would owe $640,000 on their credit cards. And the problem is that the credit cards are now maxed, and they have been maxed since January. There is no more that you can put on them. So what do you do if every single credit card that you have is maxed and you have no money in your bank account, but you have to pay bills on Monday? Well, this is where the extraordinary measures come in. These measures include the suspension of payments into the Civil Service Retirement and Disability Fund, as well as stopping paying into the Postal Service Retiree Health Benefits Fund. It also includes the suspension of payments into the Government Securities Investment Fund, which is the defined contribution retirement fund for federal employees. So because the US government has completely run out of money, when federal employees go and pay into their defined contribution pension from their salary, the US government has basically been taking that money and appropriating it instead of putting it into their pension. This money will eventually have to be paid back into the pension fund because as it stands, it's basically been stolen by the US government. Remember, this is a defined contribution pension scheme. So the situation is pretty desperate. And after 5 months of the government stealing money from federal employees, from their pension pots, from a disability fund, and from the Postal Service health plan, and dishing it out as grants to people buying new Teslas, they have finally run out of money. This time for real, and according to Janet Yellen, there are no more places where they can steal more money from, so the US government has to raise the debt ceiling. There are two main problems with increasing the US debt ceiling. The first problem is that politicians do not give a shit about fiscal management or actually trying to fix the economy, do the right thing. Politicians only give a shit about one thing and one thing only: getting re-elected. And it is a heck of a lot easier to get re-elected, have all the perks of being paid for by the taxpayer on the back of promises of increasing spending, of increasing welfare, of increasing benefits and lowering taxes. All you have to do is borrow a bit of money to pay for all of that and kick the can down the road for the next guy to worry about. The second problem with the US debt ceiling is that the people who decide on the debt ceiling are not finance professionals. They are not people who have extensive business experience or financial management experts. It's the guys in the US Congress where the majority don't have the faintest idea about finance, have no relevant expertise and no relevant experience. So instead of debating the best fiscal approach, they begin acting like 4-year-old kids in the playground. Instead of analyzing the budget, trying to understand where genuine savings can be made, instead of maybe, subsidizing people buying brand new Teslas, and maybe coming up with a reasonable path to not running a huge deficit, instead of doing the thing that the government should be doing, the US government is busy pointing fingers at each other and saying, but this, it wasn't me, it was Janet. Instead of working together on an actual solution, the two sides of the house begin doing shady backroom deals. We'll vote for increasing the debt limit if you scratch our backs and pass these completely unrelated laws over here and give us these extra perks. And of course, nobody wants to discuss these things in a timely manner because time pressure means that both sides will have to make concessions. payments. It's like a first-year college student who was given a 2-month-long assignment and remembers that he has to hand it in the night before, so pulls an all-nighter and the end result is woefully inadequate. There is no practical benefit to leaving this sort of thing to the last moment. In fact, it's actually a pretty bad thing because US treasuries maturing in the short term spike in borrowing costs because people don't want to buy bonds if the US government defaults and doesn't pay the interest on those bonds. In her letter, Janet Yellen says that if Congress fails to increase the debt limit, it would cause severe hardship to American families, harm the United States global leadership position, and raise questions about the ability of the US to defend national security interests. I guess if the Border Patrol and Army stop getting paid, they might not be quite as keen to put their lives on the line to defend the country. Now, the media is of course very excited by all the shenanigans because the United States going bankrupt makes for great headlines, but we all know that as happens every single time, the White House, the Congress, the Senate will fuck around, hold a million pointless meetings, and at the last minute will agree on increasing the debt limit because that's what they always do. Politically, they can't really afford not to. They will definitely make a big song and dance about it, they'll make threats at each other and make public statements and speeches, but they will do a deal. The reason that Janet Yellen wrote the letter yesterday, I think, is to give them a date, because before now there wasn't one, and now the deadline is June 1st. The slight issue with having used extraordinary measures since January is that the increase this time around has to be relatively more substantial than before because the US government has already stolen all of that money from the retirement and health plans of their employees, so they kind of have to put it back, or at least they can't steal any more of that money. And everyone is panicking because the rate at which the US is borrowing is exploding and showing no signs of ever being properly managed. Imagine if you're earning $100,000 a year and you have $640,000 in credit card debt, and instead of thinking how you could maybe stop spending quite as much money so that you could start actually paying those credit cards back, and instead of focusing on trying to maybe figure out how you could earn $200,000 so that you would have a bit of extra money to pay the debt back, instead you stop paying into your pension. You stop paying your health insurance and you sit at the kitchen table with your wife discussing which new credit card you should apply for. It sounds bonkers, except the same exact argument could have been made back in 1990 when the US debt pile was 90% smaller. So the big question is, how long can the US government keep borrowing money before it becomes an actual problem and the country spirals into a financial meltdown? The debt has increased 10 times in the last 33 years. So could it, for example, increase another 10 times in the next 20? Where is the line beyond which the debt is completely unsustainable? You can see that in the last update from the Congressional Budget Office, the US government expects to earn $4.8 trillion in revenue in 2023, a bit less than they did in 2022, and they expect to spend over $6.3 trillion, a fair bit more than they did last year. So far from trying to manage things, trying to solve the problem, the inability to manage the budget is only getting worse. At the same time, the US government is projecting that the revenue will increase to $7.1 trillion in 2033, which is an average growth rate of over 4% per year for the next 10 years straight, which is extremely unlikely because it is far, far above the typical rate of growth of the economy. So as well as being grossly incompetent in managing finances right now, the very same people in Congress are completely incompetent in making any reasonable forecasts for the future. Anyway, the big issue is this line down here called net interest. According to this document that was updated just now this month, the US government will be spending $663 billion on interest payments in 2023 and $745 billion in 2024. This is pretty bad because according to this data, 15% of all the money that the US government earns in all kinds of taxes is spent on paying just the interest on the debt. Not paying any of the debt back, just the interest alone is $1 in every 7 that the US government makes. But a quick look at the St. Louis Fed data on current expenditures shows that on an annualized basis, the US government is already paying way more. You can see that this chart explodes on the right. That's because the Fed has been increasing rates to 5.25% and the cost of debt to the US government is now going through the roof. In Q1, the annualized amount of interest payments was $929 billion. And remember that the Fed has said that that they will categorically not reduce rates this year. No way! They probably will reduce rates later this year with their tail between the legs because they'll have no option, but to save face, they won't do any decreases at the next two meetings in June and July, and the next meeting after that is at the end of September. So this run rate of $929 billion in interest payments isn't going anywhere in Q2 or Q3. In fact, the problem with the way that US debt is structured is that even while the rates are flat, the interest payments on the debt will keep increasing because bonds are issued over long fixed periods of time. You can have 2-year bonds, you can have a few months, you can have 5-year bonds, you can have 10-year bonds, and these bonds have fixed coupon rates. So when the government sells the bond, they fix the interest that they will have to pay over the next 2, 5, 10 years, whatever. And when that bond comes to maturity, it has to be repaid in full, and the US government doesn't have any money to actually pay back the value of the bond, because they are in a perpetual state of debt. So in order to pay back the original bond, they have to go and issue a new bond. And the old bond was maybe sitting there at 1% or 2% interest or whatever, because it was from way back when everything was great and people were trading JPEGs of monkeys wearing funny hats. But treasuries in the market now are paying more like 3.5 to 4%. So every month, the old, cheaper bonds are being replaced by the new, more expensive bonds. And if investors are concerned that the US government will default and not pay the interest, that makes things a whole lot worse, because that means that investors will want to earn more interest to cover the risk of the US government going bankrupt. And there is a decent likelihood that instead of paying $600 or $700 billion that Congress came up with, the actual bill will climb to $1.3 trillion. We already seeing it in the data. Just take roughly 4% of the 31 trillion debt pile and you'll get there. So the US debt might become more like 27% of all the tax that the US government earns, more than 1 in every $4. And the question is, how high could this number go? Because a lot of people will compare this number to a household budget and say it is already completely insane that 27% of all the money the US government earns is now going to be spent on just the interest payments alone. That's nuts, but on the other hand, the US government budget does not work in the same way as a regular household. Even though we like to liken it to something that we kind of understand in our daily lives, it's just not the same thing. In theory, the total sum of debt payments could climb a lot higher, could theoretically go above 100% of the total tax revenue. It sounds absurd, I know, but the current situation would sound absurd 50 years ago. The US government is already running a 34% deficit, and theoretically, there is no real reason why it couldn't go a heck of a lot higher to 100% and beyond. The United States has a relatively unique position where virtually all of the debt that they owe is in a currency that they also happen to control, US dollars. And the theory is that on average over time, the US economy can grow faster than inflation and can outpace the growth in the interest payments on the debt. The only precursor here is that the US dollar has to remain a global reserve currency. And a lot of newspapers and YouTubers are busy saying that the US dollar is about to be replaced by the Indian rupee or the Russian ruble or maybe Dogecoin. The truth is, in the short and medium term, the US dollar is going exactly nowhere. Not only because the US completely dominates the global economy, but because the US also dominates global geopolitics, and while every empire eventually falls, the process does not happen overnight. The dynamics of the US debt situation are ridiculous, and the thought of the US debt interest payments overtaking Social Security and health as the #1 expenditure item for the US government seems bananas right now, but practically, it would probably not change as much as people think, because even as it stands today, the debt is already fast becoming just a random number on a piece of paper. And in the long term, there are definite issues around the US dollar as a currency's valuation, the ability of the US to compete globally, blah, blah, blah. But is this a problem that is likely to blow things up this year, next year, or the year after? Well, the answer is probably not.